They're captured by special interests and they're idiots. The policy is blithering idiocy. I mean, they're not all stupid people, but the policies are blithering idiocy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Steve Hilton Show. We're still in the early days of the Trump presidency. There's a lot going on at the national level, internationally, and also here in California. We've got a great conversation coming up with Susan Shelley. We get into the whole water issue as well as the immigration issue. And those two issues are playing out very strongly in California. So we'll get into all of that. But I do want to start with what we're seeing happen now and to tie a few different issues together, if I may, because I think they're connected. So obviously one of the biggest stories, a terrible story in the last week or so, was the plane crash at Reagan National Airport in Washington, D.C., which prompted a whole discussion around the FAA and what the Biden administration had been doing. And there's a back and forth about that. And then more recently, you've seen another big story emerge over the weekend. We're taping this Monday, February the 3rd. Whenever you're watching or listening, that's when I'm speaking to you now, Monday, February the 3rd. Over the weekend just now, President Trump announced tariffs on Mexico and Canada and China. And as I speak, the situation is evolving. Just hours ago, we heard on Monday morning that, in fact, he had suspended for a month the tariffs on Mexico because Mexico had agreed to work with the administration here on reinforcing the Mexican southern border and in particular focusing on fentanyl. So this situation is emerging. So there may be more news on all of these subjects. Actually, there's another example, Panama. And you saw Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, dispatched to Panama to start the process of negotiating to make good on President Trump's promise in his inauguration speech to deal with the situation in Panama to the satisfaction of him and his administration, relating to China's influence over the Panama Canal and so on. And what you're seeing across the board is just that there's a phrase that that became well known in UK politics many years ago, decades ago actually, and I can't remember now who coined this phrase, but it's become very well known in the UK, and it's this: the smack of firm government. And it's used both in a negative sense, when you have a government that's kind of drifting around and nothing seems to happen and it's all a bit incompetent and they're at the mercy of events. And commentators will say, what we need now is the smack of firm government. And it's used in a positive sense when you have a government that comes in and deals with stuff and says, what we're seeing now is the smack of firm government. My goodness, what we're seeing now in America is exactly that, the smack of firm government. It is an absolute massive shock. And you're seeing the response in real time. There's just the speed and the pace and the confidence. You've got President Trump now just completely in command. And you saw that in relation to the crash, where he didn't have any hesitation in actually telling the truth about what happened there, which is that you have an air traffic control system that has been completely undermined by ideological prioritization during the Biden administration. There's no doubt about that. So, of course, it's true that you have to wait for the details of the investigation to emerge in terms of the specifics of the crash. But it's still a valid point, which is that they've mismanaged this agency, this crucial agency, for ideological reasons. And any time that the media or the Democrats tried to push back on what Trump was saying, oh, well, you're cutting the federal bureaucracy. And so no, we actually exempted the FAA, by the way. No, we're actually changing the standards so that we're going to have the best people. We're not going to have political or ideological priorities. And then you look back in the record, and I did this myself, and I found that there was an Inspector General report on the FAA from June 2023 that was terrifying when you read it now. And just the conclusions on the first page. I shared it on my social media. You have the Inspector General saying that 77% of critical facilities were understaffed, and they saw no prospect of the FAA getting its act together and having sufficient staffing for air traffic control. Absolutely terrifying in this report in June 2023, during the Biden administration, when Pete Buttigieg was the transportation secretary. And so you're seeing Trump just come in here and say, and sorry, you completely messed it up and we're going to fix it. And there's new transportation secretary, Sean Duffy, full disclosure, a friend of mine, obviously he was at Fox News till recently. saying, yeah, we're going to not have any other priority other than keeping people safe. And they're just, it's interesting. They're not even bothering to try and have an argument about it. They're saying this is how it's going to be. But there's a confidence, the smack of firm government. And you see it on these tariffs. And again, to me, the hysteria that popped up over the weekend after President Trump announced these was just laughable. First of all, he's doing what he said. He was incredibly clear. Even the percentages, like he said, it's going to be 25% during the campaign on these countries, and then he did it, and everyone's freaking out. Well, hang on a second, just on the basic kind of, aren't you the people that lectured us endlessly about our democracy? And isn't our democracy all about the people voting for something and then getting what they voted for? So just on that level, whether you agree or disagree with the tariffs, it's what people voted for explicitly. These countries, that this level of tariffs, that's what people voted for, and he's delivering it. And yet all the freak out over this, and hilariously, Democrats now suddenly discovering that they're anxious about grocery prices. Oh, it's terrible. We're going to have prices go up in the grocery store, when their own policies have been doing that for the last 2 years. Absolutely hilarious. But of course, the point about the tariffs, as Trump has made all along, is that they're there. It's an incredibly effective, quick tool for getting results. And you've already got results. This morning, you got Mexico saying, okay, great, we'll help you with fentanyl. I mean, it's incredible, but it's only incredible because, in a sense, this is how it should be done. I mean, this is how government should work. But you've had for so long these time-serving machine politicians who think about it a completely different way. You know, I would work back in the day in the government. I've seen it firsthand from the inside. I was in 10 Downing Street, and you have some international dispute, and there's an issue between your two countries. And so, you know, the diplomats get together and they spend 6 months putting together some kind of summit meeting, or, you know, a bilateral meeting. And then you have the agenda prepared and you have a negotiation, and then working groups are set up. And, you know, maybe 2 years later, something happens. And Trump's basically done it in 24 hours, just by sort of completely, you know, being practical and pragmatic, which is the whole point about him. I've said all along, right from when he first appeared on the stage, he's not a ideologue. He's not. He's interested in just results. He's a problem-solving, pragmatic business guy, and he's bringing that mindset. And you're seeing it right across the board. That's why when people say it's outrageous that Elon Musk is going in there and throwing his weight around, no, that's what Trump promised, and he's executing what Trump wanted. And Elon Musk is doing exactly what you would want with the government, with his Doge effort, which is to say, what is going on here? And people are up in arms about, you know, cutting off payments and people not getting money. It's our money. It's our money, and it should be spent in line with our wishes. That's what democracy is. So if you've got all these sprawling government bureaucracies where money is just going out the door with no constraint, that's what Elon Musk is finding. He's got to the heart of it within days, where normally, you know, you have the traditional way of doing it is you set up some kind of policy review and audit everything, and then, you know, there's a report, you know, 3 years later and nothing ever happens. But he's just doing it within days. And you've got, and going back to that phrase, the smack of firm government, the only way you actually make anything happen is by doing something, not talking about it. So if you just cut off the spending and, you know, shut the building, and like he's done with USAID, huge agency adding out cash to people all over the world to dubious causes, as we've seen, just stop it. And then you can get control of it. It's a completely different mindset. And then the final example, Panama. And again, all the outrage, what's he talking about? You can't take back the Panama Canal. Is he going to invade Panama? They're an ally, etc., all this stuff. Marco Rubio goes down there. He has one negotiation, one meeting with the president of Panama, who in the lead up to it, they're all saying, we won't be bullied by the US, etc., etc. Guess what? At the end of the meeting, the president announces that they will not renew the partnership with China, which is part of their, what China call the Belt and Road Initiative, which is this way of spreading their influence around the world by building and running infrastructure projects. It's a very, very explicit strategy. Xi Jinping, the Belt and Road Initiative. They build and run ports all over the world, and then they use them to, you know, put their spy stuff in there and so on. It's well known, well documented. The Panama Canal is another example of that. It's part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And there's an agreement between Panama and China. And the president of Panama, after his meeting with Marco Rubio, says, we are not going to renew it, and we are exploring getting out of it before the end of the agreement's term. Like, he just said that. So again, you're getting results because people can see across the world the smack of firm government. It is absolutely stunning to behold. And I hope that it continues because in the end, it's delivering results for all of us here in America. All right, joining us for California Corner today, our friend Susan Shelley. Susan, a couple of big stories that are getting national attention from California. Obviously, the ongoing impact of President Trump's immigration enforcement actions at the border and throughout the country, and water. Everyone's talking about water. And we've been talking about, of course, about water for many, many years because it's been a disaster, the way that the Democrats have handled it. But let's start with the water issue, and then we'll get to the immigration issue. I mean, there was a high-profile manifestation of the immigration issue with the closing down of the freeways. Protesters shut down the was one freeway, wasn't it? The 101 in Los Angeles. Lots of video of that circulating and images. But let's start with the water because there's been a lot going on just in the last week or so.
Well, the first thing that happened is President Trump came to Los Angeles, wasn't too happy with all of our elected officials, and signed an executive order that essentially he called it turning on the water. But really, if you look closely at it, what he said is that he wants to repeal something that Joe Biden did on the first day of the Biden administration. There was a specific executive order, and then there were various environmental impact statements that came later. And the one that Trump referenced in his executive order said that the Central Valley Project, the federal water project, would not have to align any longer with the state water project and all of the restrictions that California has put in place. So essentially, what he said was find this environmental impact statement, he referenced it, find the no action alternative. In other words, if you didn't make this change, and make decisions in accordance with that and maximize water deliveries to Southern California. It really had nothing to do with fighting the fires. I think what he was trying to do was get these various state and local regulations into court because I think he wants to establish clearly that after all these decisions and all these lawsuits and all these agreements and all these different things that are layered on top of each other, I think he wants to establish that the federal government has clear authority to do certain things with water distribution in California. So I think that's what it was about. He sent the Army Corps of Engineers to implement these different things that were in this no action alternative. If you look at it, it's several different rivers, several different lakes, several different dams, and the Central Valley Project, which are federal, the federal dams operated by the Army Corps of Engineers. And he wanted these specific levels of water discharge adhered to, reversing what the Biden administration had done having to do with fish and wildlife and the various federal agencies that regulate those things. So they did. The Army Corps of Engineers opened up 2 dams in Tulare County and released water on an hour's notice. Really upset a lot of people who were local. They said, well, they may own the reservoir, but we own the water and they can't do this, which indicates to me, I think the federal government knew that. I think the Trump people knew that, but wanted to test it in court. That's my theory on that.
Interesting. I mean, because what you've got, I mean, I was in Fresno just recently. We're taping this Monday, February the 3rd. On Friday, just now, I was in Fresno. I'm there often in the Central Valley. I'm a huge supporter of our agriculture industry, which has been completely under assault now from Democrats in California for years and years and years, not just on the water issue, but in all the other regulatory actions that they've taken, whether that's on pesticides and environmental, and they call it environmental, and labor regulations, on and on. I mean, it's just they're making it impossible, and it's so heartbreaking. I mean, I was just with a family who they had, I think it was, they said 5 generations. They had a fig farm in the Central Valley. Now, I've been to the fig farms, and I've helped pick. I'm really, spent a lot of time there. Not their farm. This family, they said they just sold up. They're moving to Florida. That's it. They're out. They can't make it work anymore. And there's stories like that throughout the Central Valley. And one of the most outrageous and disgusting to me, again, I met someone who was in this situation where there's a federal water district in the Central Valley, Westlands, and they're among the worst. And there you have a very common thing happening now, where because water allocations aren't being met, so the water that often farmers have paid for isn't being delivered. They just can't make it work. And so what's happening with the encouragement of previously with the Biden administration is that these, private equity firms and others are swooping in, buying up the land and turning it into giant solar farms. Solar farms. So you've got the most fertile agricultural land in the world that could be feeding us. And by the way, what we grow in California is the healthy stuff. It's what we want to be eating, what we should be eating. It's produce and fruit and nuts and vegetables, all the good things. I mean, even if you take, so look how the MAHA, Make America Healthy Again, idea has really captured the imagination of the country. Well, we should be leading that in California. Instead, you're having farms where you could be growing citrus and tomatoes and broccoli and all these good things. You got sort of horrible, giant industrialized solar farms. And the last point on that is that, insanely, I was learning from some of the pistachio almond groves that are nearby, where if you have a solar farm that gets put next to your farm, where you have tree nuts in particular, tree nuts require a certain amount of time during the year where the temperature is below a certain level. It's called chill hours. Otherwise, they don't grow. They don't show the natural process doesn't happen. It's about 1,000 hours a year, I should say, where you need the temperature to be below a certain level. And the solar farms sort of attract heat and heat up the local area. So you've got this nonsense of this thing that's supposed to be, the idea is that it's helping with climate change. That's actually changing the climate in the Central Valley. And so all these things are going on, and they're so angry about it. In terms of the water specifically, it's interesting because the tactic that seems to be used by the Democrats, whether that's state or federal, they keep coming back to this endangered species thing, right? And it's like they're using endangered species listings as the excuse to do anything they want.
Yes. Well, we have like a 50-year agreement that we're under, self-imposed. I think it's called the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, and it calls for co-equal goals of ecosystem preservation and human needs. Now that is a very harsh thing to impose, because if there's a drought, if the farms can't maintain their production level, if the cities are starved of water, what are we doing? We're flushing water out to the ocean for ecosystem preservation. Is that necessary? Is it the best balance? And yet we have this so-called co-equal goal, and how they
When was it? Says 50 years old. I hadn't.
it's we're in the middle of it. It's
Right.
you can find it as early as 2016, maybe earlier, but this is what we're living under, that and many lawsuit settlements over endangered species. President Trump's executive order, by the way, called for expediting the process of exemptions from the federal Endangered Species Act and overriding the California Endangered Species Act, overriding any state or local law, ordinance, regulation, or rule that is in the way of maximizing water deliveries to Southern California. Interestingly, what you're saying about the solar farms and the purchase of the land for solar farms, if President Trump is successful, probably in court, if he's successful in taking control of the federal water distribution system in California, then those farms will suddenly be more valuable as farms than they are when they can't have any water. And so he's sort of, pardon the expression, upstream of the problem here,
Right.
trying to get control away from California regulators, because
Yeah.
they are starving human needs for environmental, I think,
Yes.
nihilism. Honestly, I don't think it's environmental protection. I think it's
It's not.
nihilism.
It's not environmental protection. I mean, I shot some video down there when I was in Fresno, and there's a very vivid example of it. It is nihilism because, I mean, I'll just describe it now, and people who are listening or watching, you can check out the video separately later. I went to a field where it's a farmer with different types of crops, almonds, pistachios, citrus, other stuff as well. In fact, basically the way that they described it, it's a third, a third, a third. So they have a third of their land was nuts, almonds and pistachios mainly. You have a third which is other fruits, so stone fruit, so peaches and plums, and then a third they leave it for open. ground where you grow, you can rotate that more rapidly. The trees are there, right? They last for a long time. An almond tree produces almonds for like 25 years, pistachios even longer. So they're there and they're fixed. But the third of the land, they you can change. You know, one year it may be tomatoes, the next year it may be onions and broccoli, etc. So you can change that more quickly. And two consequences have happened now that they're being denied the water. And by the way, that when we say denied the water, this year they've been told they're getting 20 so far, and it changes month by month, 20% of their allocation. 20%. So that of what they need. And by the way, that's an improvement. Like a few months ago, they were told 5%. 5%. So it's just a nightmare for these farmers. Anyway, the vivid image that I've captured on video is that because of this, they have if you're getting less water, obviously you have to restrict what you do. And how do you do that? The first thing to go is the open fields where you're just changing that year by year. You just don't plant anything. So that's just fallow. And then even worse than that, once you've exhausted the possibilities of restriction there, if you're a farmer, and this is the saddest thing that I saw with my own eyes, you take out the trees because they're very, and so that they're literally ripping out almond trees, pistachio trees, and the field that's left is basically this dust. It turns into a dust bowl. So how's that good for the environment? It's absolutely heartbreaking. It's so stupid.
It is stupid, and the policies with water as they've affected wildfires, it's not just water, it's land management
Yes,
generally.
yes.
That's no good either. And one of the things President Trump said in his executive order is he wants a complete federal review of all programs, subsidies, projects involving California land management, water, and disaster prevention and response. And when he says he's reviewing the programs, what he means is he could pull the funding. And that is what he has over California. He could pull the funding from all or some of these programs and use that as leverage to get California to do sensible policies, which is his goal, which is perfectly fine. To say that California is mismanaged, it is mismanaged, and it needs to be better managed because terrible things are happening. And even the response to the terrible things when they happen is terrible.
Yes, it's terrible. It's a crime. I mean, I just the more you look at it, it's a crime. I mean, and then you look at the forests. I mean, obviously there are two types of the land management. You've got the Sierra forests, like big trees. It's a forest, and then you have the coastal ranges in LA and Southern California, where what we've just seen happen in Los Angeles, and that's chaparral. It's different, but it's the same point, which is you have to manage the fuel load. You can't let it just get overgrown. And all these agencies and all these policies have let that happen. And then, of course, and you can see the federal interest because it's interesting. I'd love to get into this with you a little bit because instinctively, I'm very much, a 10th Amendment absolutist in the sense that I do think that, centralization of power is generally a bad thing. That's why I was in favor of Brexit and wanted to get out of the European Union. And I think it's the same here. You don't want the federal government micromanaging absolutely everything. Power should be decentralized. And the 10th Amendment states that things that aren't explicitly in the Constitution should be reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. And so it's an interesting tension for me because on the one hand, yeah, it's good to see a federal government that has common sense policies and an understanding of the issues, trying to push California in a sensible direction. On the other hand, it's like, we should be doing that from here. And if you have a federal government with the wrong ideas, as has been happening with Biden, then they're imposing it in the wrong way. So I don't know what to make of all of that. But the point I wanted to come to was, and I love your reaction to all of this, is that, well, the federal government has a stake in this because as we're seeing right now, who's on the hook for the compensation for what's happened? I mean, Biden said we're going to guarantee, was it in total 100% of the spending to deal with the disaster in Los Angeles, even though it was caused by California policies.
It sure was caused by California policies. And one of the most interesting things that we're seeing is in response to the disaster, the governor is suspending a lot of regulations and has acknowledged that California has overregulation. So he suspended CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, for rebuilding purposes. He suspended the Coastal Commission's power for rebuilding purposes. And he just issued an executive order, an emergency declaration changing the water policy for diverting floodwater to groundwater recharge. Now, this was interesting. We had this set of laws on the books that when you're having heavy rain and you have a flood, and you have floodwaters coming in, it wasn't possible to divert that to groundwater recharge. It had to just go out and flood to the ocean. Well, in order to do the groundwater recharge, it had to be diverted. Some of these streams had to be diverted to these floodplain areas. Well, there were regulations saying you had to get the permission of the Fish and Wildlife Department, and they might ask you to do a report on how the floodwater was going to affect the habitat. And by the time you did that, the rainstorm had come and gone, and you weren't able to divert the water. In 2023, in the middle of a budget trailer bill, there was a provision that said, we're going to make this easier to do this. We're going to ease this, but you still have to get a flood report. You have to go to the Fish and Wildlife Department, but you still have to get a flood report before you can do one of these things. So it rains again, and again, they can't get the paperwork done in time to get the water diverted for groundwater recharge. So now, this is what the governor's latest executive order, emergency order, has done. It waives the need for this flood report that the water districts would have to do before anybody could divert water in the middle of a rainstorm for groundwater recharge. They just keep trying to lift these regulations temporarily. They need to go through them with a hatchet and really
Yes,
prune them back.
100%. I mean, I actually find it infuriating, I've got to be honest with you, which, and we're seeing it's a real pattern in the last few weeks where you have Newsom's running around saying, "Oh, I mean, you saw it. He literally saying we got to get rid of all. This is a quote. All these nonsense regulations." Yeah. Well, who put
Yeah,
them there? Who put them there?
exactly.
You did, and you collectively, you Democrats. I mean, no one else has been in charge. And
Exactly.
even if you say, "Well, it wasn't us; it was the bureaucracies," that's an even worse answer. They're totally unaccountable. They work for you. If you don't like it, stop them, shut
He
them down.
appointed them.
You know,
He
it's just
appointed those
he
people,
pointed the people. Exactly. It's infuriating to it. You have, I mean, Karen Bass in LA just suspended the what's it called? Electric Homes Building Code for the rebuilding in Palisades and the other fire affected areas. So the 2022 building code was all electric, as you're seeing across California. Insane. I mean, you and I have talked about that before. No more gas stoves, no more gas boilers. Everything has to be electric. Every appliance. So that's the rule in Los Angeles, as it is elsewhere in the state, which of course is crazy and makes things more expensive in the short term and burdens our electric grid, which can't cope anyway because they're stupid policies on wind and solar. I mean, the whole thing is so
the
mad.
whole thing, yes.
Anyway, so but guess what? She suspends it for the rebuilding in Los Angeles because it's too costly and we don't want to put any barriers in people's way. And then on top of that, there's a guy, one of the state representatives talking about it, says that this is great. We don't want to be, this is again a quote, we don't want to be too micromanagey with people who are suffered from the fires. Yes, of course I agree that you
Yes.
don't want to be too micromanaged for the people affected by the fires. Of course we should get rid of anything that stops them or slows them down or increases the cost of rebuilding. But why just them? And why just now? The same with all these things that Newsom's doing. Well, just get rid of all of it. I mean, if you're acknowledging that it's nonsense, and Karen Bass is acknowledging that it makes things more expensive and more of a hassle, and with the water that you're talking about, if Newsom is now saying, "Oh yeah, we really should capture the stormwater," why not do it all the time? I mean, these people are so infuriating.
Well, they're captured by special interests and they're idiots. That's the other part of this. California is the policy is blithering idiocy. I mean, they're not all stupid people, but the policies are
Yes.
blithering idiocy. And when the consequences arrive, they arrive in your electric bill, they arrive in your gas bill, they arrive in the price of gasoline when you go to fill up your car. They arrive all throughout these disasters. The consequences are here. And here's the real problem. Federalism can only work if the elections are clean. If you don't have clean elections, then the people who are in power can stay in power even though their policies are a catastrophe. And I really wonder how long it's going to be before Californians rise up and say, we want voter ID, we want one-day elections, we want vote by mail by request only. We're cleaning this up.
I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, we're going to have, I mean, voter ID, people are working on a ballot initiative for 2026. So
Excellent.
I know that's happening. And I'm pretty sure that will pass overwhelmingly if it's on the ballot. And then the other thing I'd add to the clean elections point is the gerrymandering. Because a lot of this stuff comes from the state legislature. And of course, it's true that Gavin Newsom controls the executive branch. We do much more to rein in the agencies and all these bureaucracies. But the legislation that they're implementing comes from the legislature, and they have the supermajority, the Democrats. But it's not a legitimate supermajority because they have, even as we've discussed, even in a bad year for Republicans, it's 40% of the vote in California. Just, it's higher than that. Actually, it's like 41, 42, 43 sometimes. That call it 40%. You have nothing like 40% Republican representation in the legislature. I mean, it was 20%. Now it's like, I think, 25. So, that's a direct result of gerrymandering. So if you had fair representation, if you had fair votes, of course, you'd have a higher Republican vote. And if you had fair representation, you wouldn't have a supermajority. And then the Republicans would be able to stop or slow this stuff down. And people say, well, the moderate first of all, there are hardly any moderate Democrats. They're a joke. They don't stand up to the far left. But if you actually had 40% Republican representation in the legislature, then you could stop some of this stuff.
Hmm. You could, and you have to. And I think you're right that the districts are a problem. But the bigger problem is that we just have this Democratic machine that
Yeah.
is running California.
Yeah.
And the voters have tried several times to break it up. They passed term limits, they passed citizen redistricting, everything was gamed. Everything
Everything
turned
is
in.
gamed. Yeah,
And even the top 2 primary, that was another reform that the voters wanted
exactly.
because they're not happy. They're not happy with the direction of California. Every poll shows it, and the U-Haul sales show it.
That's
So,
right. People are
you're
leaving.
seeing this. People are not happy, but the government is not responsive. They are gaming the system every time. They are intentionally ignoring the will of the voters. And I think, honestly, it may have finally caught up to them because when you see Gavin Newsom essentially tracking with Donald Trump an emergency order to store more water, this is telling me that he's doing some polling, and Trump's policies are very popular in California. That in itself is a remarkable thing.
Because it's common sense. It's not ideological. This is the
Exactly.
big difference. And this is why everything is, we're the worst on everything in California on any issue. That's the, theme of my book, Califalia, reversing the ruin of America's worst run state. Please go and pre-order it now on Amazon. It's out in a few weeks. But the thing is that it's been totally ideological. And so these people who are empowering in California and have been for years now, it's very obvious they're not getting up in the morning thinking, how do I solve problems? How do I make life easier for this small business or for this family or whatever? It's all about how do I move forward the climate agenda? That's how they think, right? How do I advance labor? It's all about these ideological impulses. And that's why actually you're totally right. The democratic machine. I know it's a bit of a cliche to talk about the whatever it is you would talk about the homeless industrial complex, but it does capture something. And there really is a Democrat industrial complex in California, which is this terrible combination of the machine politicians that they elect, increasingly unimpressive people who are just pushed through by the machine, the unions who fund them and put them there, the activists who basically give them their ideological marching orders, and then the bureaucrats they appoint who implement all this crap. I mean, it really is that, the Democrat industrial complex, and we just got to smash the whole thing.
And then you have the courts appointed
Oh,
by the
brilliant point.
Democratic
Exactly.
governors.
Yes.
One of the most disturbing things I've seen is having the state Supreme Court take the Taxpayer Protection Act off the
Yes.
ballot. After it qualified for last November's ballot, it would have made significant changes. It was an initiative, a citizens' initiative signed by 1.4 million Californians. The governor and the legislature sued to take it off the ballot rather than let it go through the electoral process and then challenge anything they thought wasn't right or wasn't constitutional. No, 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 they didn't want the California voter to have the opportunity to see what could be changed in California. They didn't even want it on the ballot. They didn't want the debate. And so they sued to have it taken off the ballot, and shockingly, the state Supreme Court did so. When what they should have said, according to all the precedents, is, "No, we'll see what the voters think and then come talk to us if they pass it."
Yes, to their own precedent. That's what you're quite right. Thank you for reminding me. The courts, a huge part of it. And that Supreme Court, it's a 6-1 appointed by Democrat governors, isn't it, right
I
now?
believe
That's
so, yes. But it was a unanimous decision. It was a decision that was sort of, well, we're just gonna go with the government here because we don't think taxes should be lower, and we don't think fees should be lower, and we don't one of the things in that measure that the court didn't like is a requirement for when these appointed agencies come up with fees, which are really taxes, those things had to be approved by an elected body, the state legislature or the board of supervisors of a county or the city council. They had to approve those fees, which were really taxes. And the state Supreme Court said, "Oh my, that's just too much. That completely undoes the Constitution of California. That's a revision. You can't do that in an initiative." That is an insane position to take. To say that the legislature has to approve taxes is insane. To say that can't be done by initiative when all you're doing is restoring the Constitution itself, it's insane. And yet that's what they did. So it's machine politics from top to bottom.
yes. And so what is I mean, so you could say, I mean, I'm very, clear in saying that the super majority in Sacramento is illegitimate. It is the direct result of gerrymandering. It does not reflect the will of the people. When you look at the Supreme Court, I mean, they're appointed over the years. It's just calcified, isn't it? I mean, they were appointed correctly, fair enough. The governor appoints them, but it's become this. It's a really good point. I think we should not lose sight of that and not forget what they did. What do you do about that? You can't. I mean,
If they're going to pull initiatives off the ballot, I mean, that's the direct democracy power that the Constitution has for the people of California since 1911. If the government is going to sue to stop initiatives, then we're really off the notes here. And we don't have a Republican form of government in California. We have essentially an authoritarian machine dictatorship. And this is why people are so frustrated in California because terrible things are happening. Other states are not having these problems. It's not just climate change affecting only California. It's very frustrating to people, and so many people are just leaving. They've just given up on it, and they're just leaving.
well, as people know, I'm not. I'm fighting back. I'm seriously considering running for governor to fix all this, and it can be fixed if we really fight for it. Um, and so I think that the question is, what exactly can you do? And I'm very interested in the courts aspect. I mean, I spent a lot of time looking and by the way, that's one factor in evaluating the decision. People say, well, why don't if you're gonna do it, do it. Well, I think that you got to do it seriously and with two things in mind. One, if you do it, can you actually win? And B, if you win, can you actually make a change happen that's meaningful? And I think the answer to the second one is yes, especially given the control over the executive branch and the agencies. And by the way, we're seeing that with President Trump at the federal level. That kind of attitude, simply put, Doge California, I think is very much part of it. But in terms of the courts aspect, that's an interesting one. I'd love to maybe another time, Susan, talk with you a bit in more detail about that, about what could be done, because it's a really big part of the problem, isn't it? Because
Yes, it
they
is.
they they are effectively now part of this Democrat machine.
It looks that way. I wouldn't have said that before they took the Taxpayer Protection Act
Yeah,
off the ballot, but that was
yeah.
that was a real earth-shaking moment, I think, in California history where the Supreme Court told the voters of California, "You can't have this initiative."
It's
That was
outrageous.
shocking.
Yeah, it's there's so much is happening all the time here and across the country and the election and whether like it's so easy to forget these massive things. Um, and
There's a
that
lot
was a
going on.
really big one. Exactly. Let's quickly talk about the other thing that I mentioned at the top of our conversation, which is the immigration enforcement, and came, like vivid illustration of the pushback this weekend. Los Angeles protesters shut down the 101. They were was it Mexican flags they were waving? What was that about?
Yes. Well, they're upset with President Trump's policy of mass deportation. They're upset. But very interestingly, the public is not upset. The public is supportive according to every poll. There were, I think, four major polls, national polls, that showed more than 55% of Americans support the deportation of everyone who is in the country illegally. I found that shocking. That's about 20 points higher than it was before Joe Biden's presidency. So there's his legacy right there. He opened the border, and the whole country has had it with illegal immigration. They're at the point where they want to deport everybody. And you want to talk about what the polls are showing, you know that these politicians are seeing that because you've got these protests in the street, but you don't have any elected officials marching with them, do you? You don't have them on television saying, "Oh, we're going to oppose Donald Trump on this and that." There are a few who are saying it. Tony Thurmond, the superintendent of public instruction, has said he's backing legislation to create a 1 mile safe zone around schools where ICE will not be allowed to operate. I don't think he's going to be able to do that, but that's what he's trying to take a stand, but in general, I have seen politicians kinda stay away from this issue, and that tells you where the polls are in California.
It's interesting because you look at the people positioning themselves, and actually, it actually fits with what I was about to say. I didn't know that about Tony Thurmond, but just specifically on that point about schools. So Tom Homan, who really knows what he's talking about, obviously deeply, and has remember worked for. I mean, he was awarded with a medal by President Obama, so he's been doing this for many, many years under many 5 presidents, I believe. He knows what's going on, and so and he has a good answer to all of these points. So I saw him on an interview. I think it was CNN or somewhere else, hostile, maybe been MSNBC. I can't recall. And he was asked about the schools point specifically because they changed the the regulations to enable them to go to schools and churches. And and he said, and the interview was like, "Why? It's outrageous. You're going to be having ICE agents going into schools and whatever." And he said, "Do you not know what's going on? We have gang members, violent, murdering, drug dealing gangs in this country, and many of them are 15-year-old, 70, and so, yeah, they sometimes go to schools. So you think we should just leave them there? We're not going there to do anything with the law-abiding kids, but if you've got a violent gang member who's hiding in a school, of course we should get them." And so that yet again, you have um, the Democrats in the form of this guy Thurmond taking the side of some of the most vicious, violent criminals. It's just extraordinary, purely through ideology, because they want to be on that side of the argument. It's just unbelievable. But actually, the point I wanted to make about the politicians is that you're right that basically they're not all sort of going to the barricades this time. And if you look at the city leadership and the county leadership in California, the mayors of the big cities, then they're not freaking out over this. But the people who are making a political point, well, the only one I had noticed before you mentioned Tony Thurmond is Rob Bonta, the state attorney general. He's also out there talking about all this stuff, and then we're going to defend against Trump. And what do they have in common? Tony Thurmond already is running for governor, and Rob Bonta is rumored to be running for governor, and it's a Democrat primary. So, of course, they're going to be wanting to appeal to the far left base of the party. So that's why I suspect they're both doing it.
But look what just happened in the legislature, where they were about to spend $25 million of the taxpayers' money to defend people from deportation, and somebody asked, "How do you guarantee that this money won't be used to defend violent criminals and making it possible for them to stay in the country?" There was no answer to
Yeah.
that. The answer from the Department of Finance was, "Well, that's not the intent." And the next thing you know, they pulled the vote, and they did not vote on the $25 million for that at all. So this Trump-proofing of California and, fighting the deportation, clearly the polls have
Exactly.
come back.
This is exactly the point you're making, and you're completely right. Like, they are realizing that they're on the wrong side of this argument.
Yes, they are, and this is an argument that is costing them votes in every demographic, which they did not anticipate. Uh, 10 years ago, the conventional wisdom in politics was that the Latino vote was Democrat for the rest of time. And unless the Republicans got on board with so called comprehensive immigration reform, meaning a path to citizenship for everybody and amnesty, unless the Republicans did that, they'd never win another election for the rest of history. That was the conventional wisdom that was told to Republican politicians. I know I was in the room for several of those presentations from consultants. And then Donald Trump came down the escalator and didn't do that, and now he has a higher percentage of the Latino vote than any Republican in, I don't know, generations. So this is an interesting educational seminar for the Democrats and the consultants. They were wrong about everything, and these chickens have come home to roost.
And one of the most amazing polls in the entire election cycle, last in 24 election, I can't remember, September, October, close before the election, was a poll. I mean, you mentioned earlier the major, support for the deportation of all uh, people who are here illegally, 50, whatever the percent number was across the country. But I don't know if it's that poll that you're referencing, but I distinctly remember an Axios poll that asked the same question, and then they broke it down demographically. And the single demographic group that had the highest proportion agreeing with the statement, all illegal immigrants should be deported, not just the criminals, everyone, the highest support was among Latino voters, higher than any other group.
Well, this is a really tough situation for everybody who is a working person, that people are coming into the country to work for less money, cash under the table, and sometimes to get government benefits at the same time. And for Americans of any heritage, that's really offensive. After a while, it really gets to be upsetting. And there's a point at which people will go about their lives and not pay attention, and then there's a point at which it's past that point. And we passed that point during the Biden administration when that border was open and all of these migrants were flown into all of these different cities around the country by the Biden administration, by the Department of Homeland Security, which used a law from 1973, I think it is, for case by case parole of people who were inadmissible to admit hundreds of thousands of people and fly them around the country to different destinations and overwhelm the social safety net in city after city after city. And essentially, it made the whole country a border town, and people didn't want that.
I mean, some of the most vivid protests were in Chicago, weren't they? Those public meetings with
Yes.
and black residents of Chicago saying, "What is this?" And it's just so infuriating to people who've. I mean, I relate to it as an immigrant myself. When you go through the process, and of course, we were, just I'd worked in the government and so on, and so the manner that we came here was we had visa. It was all visa, green card, citizenship. That process took, I can't remember the total number of years, 8 years, something like that. And it was annoying and bureaucratic, but I'm not, I'm complaining about it. I think it should be hard to become an American citizen. You shouldn't just sort of get it on a plate. It's an incredible honor, the greatest privilege you could possibly have. And so I don't like bureaucracy and dealing with the government, but that's the deal. But for others, it's much more difficult. I mean, you speak to families who've been, 20, 30 years dealing with the system to try and get their papers in order and so on, and then they finally do it, and it's an amazing thing. And so they resent the fact that you've got people who just show up and increasingly not even from, certainly not Mexico, not even from Central and South America, but from China and India and goodness knows where, just walking in. And then the final insult, to me, the thing that captured it most and really explained this resentment from people who are here, from immigrants who are here already, was that proposal from the California legislature to give undocumented immigrants, illegal people who are here illegally, taxpayer-funded down payment assistance to buy a house when barely anyone could afford to buy a house in California. You've got people working incredibly hard, 2 jobs, 3 jobs, the whole family, and they're saving up, and they still can't afford to buy a house because of the ridiculous, policies that we've talked about elsewhere that have made it so expensive, giving us the highest housing costs in America. And then someone who just like walks across the border, gets taxpayer money for a down payment. It's so offensive.
Well, also, full scope Medi-Cal. Medi-Cal is the safety net health insurance program for low-income Californians, and now, according to the state legislature and signed by Governor Newsom, everyone who comes into the state who is an illegal immigrant is entitled to exactly the same full scope Medi-Cal, not the limited Medi-Cal like other states, which covers emergencies and pregnancy and different things like that, but the full health insurance.
Yeah.
You come into the country illegally and you come to California, you can sign up for full health insurance, 100% paid for by the California
Yes.
taxpayers.
And it is, I think I'm correct in saying it's the biggest single increase in the state budget in recent years was this policy. The
It
biggest single
probably is.
increase.
It's an entitlement. We don't even know how much it'll cost because it's an entitlement. It costs whatever it costs.
Yes. And so when people, I mean, and by the way, they've doubled the budget in the last 10 years after taking account of inflation, even as our population is falling because of the U-Haul point. They've doubled the budget. Where's it going? Things like this. What's the, I always forget, what's the name of the emergency Medicaid that other states, that we could be doing that other states do? There's a name for it, isn't there?
It's called restricted benefits or restricted Medicaid,
Right.
and it covers what the Supreme Court said all the states and the federal government have to cover, which is pregnancy and emergency services, and I think there were a few things that were added to that. But it's not full insurance for free. So people who are low income and qualify for Medicaid in any state get full insurance. But here's what happens when you increase the number of people who are on this program. There aren't any more doctors. You know, you can open up the rolls and double the registration, the enrollment in the program, but that doesn't create double the doctors who are willing to see patients. And California has very low reimbursements by comparison to other states and high expenses for Medicare Medi-Cal providers. And so they will not see as many Medi-Cal patients as there are who need to see them. So this is creating long waits, and this is taking away services from Californians who need these social safety net services and are entitled to receive them. This is being watered down because of this policy of giving more benefits to people who are in the country illegally. And if you think Californians don't get annoyed with that, I can tell you they do. They also don't like the fact that there's all this pressure on the housing market where there's a lack of inventory of housing, and there's all this pressure for density and all this pressure for more people coming in and using water while they're telling Californians,
Yeah.
don't use water, don't use electricity, cut back on everything you're doing because we have to have more apartment buildings in your single family neighborhood for all the people who are coming into the country illegally. Do you think people don't resent that? Of
Yeah.
course they do, and that's
Yeah.
in these polls also.
Yeah. You put it together beautifully. And I wonder actually, well, we'll see, as you haven't seen any sign of this yet, whether some Democrats will break ranks on this as well, and you'll see Democrats advocating for pulling back the Medicaid funding and just saying, no, we should do what other states do and do the restricted version of Medicaid.
I think we're close to that happening.
Interesting. It'll be really interesting. All right, Susan, thank you so much. Great to talk all this through. As always, we will see you very soon. Follow Susan. You must follow Susan on X. I learned so much from that. Can you tell everyone where
You
what
can
you're?
find me at x.com/Susan_Shelley, Shelley.
And you post all your articles there, of course, New York Post from time to time, as well as Orange County Register, Southern California News Group. Fantastic. Great to see you, Susan. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
All right, just a last thing I want to get off my chest, which is watching all these confirmation hearings going on in the Senate. I mean, my goodness, have you ever seen a more pompous bunch of bloviators than these senators? I mean, they think with all these ridiculous grandstanding and verbose speechifying that they're doing something to, I don't know, damage the credibility of the people they're attacking, whether that's RFK Jr. or Tulsi Gabbard or Kash Patel or any of them. I think it's the exact opposite. They're the ones, the senators, who are destroying their own reputations because they're just making fools out of themselves. They look like a joke. It's a confirmation hearing. So when you see a senator just sitting there making a speech for most of their time, and then they ask a question, trying to get information, and then the nominee starts answering the question, they basically shut him up. Sorry, no time. I've got to get back to making my speech. It's a joke. It's a total joke. They're making complete fools of themselves. And again, as I was saying at the top of the show, it's the contrast between the old way of doing things. I just think it seems ridiculous now. These politicians who don't get it. No one's interested in this stuff anymore. They're not interested in the niceties and speechifying. They just want results. It's not even appropriate for them to be doing this because their role is very clear. It is not to air their policy disagreements with these nominees. And whatever you think about RFK on vaccines or Tulsi on intelligence or Kash Patel on the role of the FBI, whatever, doesn't matter. Or on the policy front, that was all decided in the election. Donald Trump won. All these people were around him. No one could have been in any doubt. Rally after rally with Kash Patel, with Tulsi Gabbard, with RFK Jr., part of the team making those exact arguments, and he won the election. So it's none of their business, these senators, whether they agree or disagree on the policy. They shouldn't even be asking questions on that. They have one job, which is to establish whether these people are qualified. That's the role. It is not to, agree with them on the policy, one way or the other. So they're going way over their bounds. And again, it's, to me, just discredits them completely. And so the whole thing is a joke. I'm sure they'll all be confirmed. I mean, famous last words. You can go back and tell me that I got that completely wrong. But it feels to me like they will, because I think that the Republican senators who in the end will decide, I think they got more sense. They realize that there's no patience for this crap from the public. Like, we voted for this and we expect to get it delivered. Now, Trump is doing that, as I said at the top of the show, across all these policy issues. And it should happen in relation to his nominees as well, to get the government that he wants and that we voted for. All right, that is our show for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Tell me what you think. And please make sure you tell all your friends about the Steve Hilton Show. Follow us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you back here next week for our next episode.